Hello, welcome to Mitigating Workplace Risk with Cannabis Breath Testing, a webinar hosted by Concentra. I'm Rafael and I will be your moderator for today. Our presenters are Nina French and Vince Bonomo from Hound Labs. Nina French is President of Employer and Law Enforcement Solutions at Hound Labs with more than 30 years in the employment screening industry and extensive knowledge and experience with drug testing, statuses, regulation, and case law. Vince Bonomo is Senior Business Development Manager at Hound Labs with more than 30 years in the employment screening industry and a sharp focus on development, managing comprehensive workplace, substance, and occupational health testing program solutions. Nina, Vince, we are ready to begin.
Thank you. And thank you guys for attending, and thank you, Concentra, for hosting this webinar for us. Vince and I are going to be going through the presentation today, and we'll be going back and forth a little bit. We openly admit that we don't always follow our slide deck exactly, but what we really wanted to do is start with a conversation about cannabis, right? And so the title of today's webinar is Mitigating Risk. You cannot listen to the evening news, pick up a newspaper, get your information online without hearing about cannabis legalization. It is widely available, but it is also extraordinarily confusing. And I love our intro for Vince and I also hate the fact that you get to do some math, and we're not spring chickens, nor is cannabis. We have been in this industry for over 30 years. I think that people think about cannabis legalization in the United States and say, this is new. Well, it's not new, right? California legalized medicinal marijuana in 1996. And I hate to do that math for you, but that's over 27 years ago. And so it has progressed over the course of nearly 3 decades. And what really we know is that it is legal almost everywhere. And if it's not legal, with the exception of the state of South Carolina, hopefully you can identify that on this map, a neighboring state has legal cannabis. So we know that use has expanded greatly, whether it's those 23 states in DC that has recreational use, or it's the 43 states in DC who have medicinal use. There is widespread access, and we see that, we know it, and we hear about it. And so what really today we hope to explain to you is not the details of these, right? Vince and I are not lawyers. We don't want to talk about the details. What we want to talk about is the impact and the risk. If you're on the phone and you are testing your workplace, we're going to bring you back to what that means and why you're doing it, and hopefully allow you to see how cannabis is impacting workplace drug testing, what recent use means, and why it's really important, and then remembering foundationally what all of the workplace drug testing is all about. So I'm going to set the stage. Vince, feel free to jump in whenever you want to, when I forget something or I go off on a tangent. Happy to hear that. And we're going to shoot for about 45 minutes. So hopefully you guys can stay engaged during that time frame. And again, this is not to quiz people on what are the laws, what are the regulations, what are the rules, but really to give you a frame of reference when you're thinking about the impact to workplace and workplace testing and workplace testing risk. So when you think about where we are, and you think about that slide I just showed you with all of the different states and what is recreational, right? So even that is confusing. We hear recreational, it's technically adult use. So it isn't recreational for everybody, but it is adult use in those states. Medicinal means different things to different people, right? In different states. So medicinally, in the state of Pennsylvania, you have, I think, 21 different ailments from anxiety to neuropathy that will allow you to get a medical card. And that medical card gives you access to dispensaries that can provide you with leaf, tinctures, oils. We don't do edibles in the state of Pennsylvania. I could go to New Jersey, which is my neighboring state, and get those if I wanted to, but I can't get those in Pennsylvania. The exception for that is these things called troncs, which are basically a cough drop, and you can get those. Now, why? I don't know. And that's part of the confusion, right? So, as an employer, it is really difficult to keep up. This is my full-time job, and I've been doing it for my entire career, and it's still very difficult to keep up with all of the nuances in each of the states. So, some of the important pieces that you're hearing are, first of all, cannabis and THC. Well, what's the difference? Cannabis is the plant, right? Within cannabis, there's a whole bunch of different things. So, you'll hear things about CBD. CBD is a component of cannabis. It does not make you high. It may include some THC, right? So there's a lot of nuances to this. THC is what it's the psychoactive component, right? Simply put, it is what gets you high, right? And so when we're thinking about cannabis and the workplace, you have to think about that. And why do we say cannabis? Well, because it's the plant. Marijuana is actually a slang term, but it's the one we're most familiar with. So you will see those words in laws. You're also starting to see in some laws language about impairment. We're going to talk a little bit in some of these upcoming slides about impairment and really some of the dangers of that when you're talking about risk and how to mitigate that in your workplace, right? So if you think right now about your workplace drug testing panel, it is rare that anybody's doing a panel of one drug. Likely you're doing something around a 5-panel, which if it's a DOT 5-panel, we all know the DOT 5-panel is actually 14 different drugs because you're talking about drug categories. When you think about impairment and you think about testing in the workplace, I want you to first ask yourself, what is the impairment level for codeine? Or what is the impairment level for oxy? Or what's the impairment level for amphetamines? And if you're trying to Google it and look quickly, the answer is there is not one. The reason that there is not one is because workplace drug testing is not about impairment. Even when you think about the instances of reasonable suspicion or post accident, a workplace drug test is not indicative of impairment. To some degree, an alcohol test is also not, right? An alcohol test is a time-based test where your breath is measuring the amount of alcohol in your system, right? And then someone took that data and put that with these millions and millions of data points we've collected over the past century and said, we believe at this point, at this level, that indicates that we see that there is impaired behavior, right? Cognitive behavior. And so that's a long sort of stated issue. But again, when you're thinking about impairment in the workplace, if you're a DOT employer, we remove people from performing safety sensitive positions at a 0.02 and take actions well before a 0.08. And think that through when you're thinking about impairment, right? Impairment in the workplace is being introduced laws in some of these new laws. And as employers, we really want to push back on that because the strength of workplace drug testing is not in the identification of impairment. The strength of workplace drug testing is mitigating risk. It is deterring an incident or an accident from occurring before it happens, right? That's really the key. And so when we look at these new laws, really what they are is a reaction, right? Legislation occurred in many different states that said we're going to now allow medicinal or recreational use of marijuana. But then they thought, oh, now we've got to protect the employees, right? So we see employment protections. And that's where they started introducing impairment, a little bit of confusion there. And then they realized, well, wait a second. Many of these very tried and true, very good drug testing methodologies that we have had in place over the past 40 years of workplace drug testing there's a little bit of flaw in the thinking, right? They're precise, they're accurate, they're proven. They're excellent, excellent at deterring use in the workplace. What they're not excellent at is, unfortunately, identifying just those THC metabolites that don't last for I'm sorry, that parent drug. They look at those metabolites, and that can last in your system, depending on the method you're using for cannabis, for an extended period of time. And so we've really worked ourselves into this difficult position in the United States in how are we going to allow employers to continue to use this super valuable tool, but not infringe upon the use rights of those employees in that state. And so really that's where Hound Labs came into play. We're trying to solve that. Now, if you don't believe me, I think the Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index that's published annually is a great indicator of this. If you look at the trends of workplace drug testing, way back in the day when it started, we were at about a 13.6% positivity rate for workplace drug testing, right? And that's all drugs, that's not just cannabis. And what did that tell us? Well, it told us a lot of people were using it, but you see that steady decline, right? This very steady decline tells us something. It tells us not that people stopped using drugs, but that it started to deter use in the workplace. And this time frame around this 2012 period is really important. And this is really the proof in the pudding, right? We were in the middle of an opioid epidemic in this country. We were also at the point where states began to legalize cannabis use recreationally. We already had it medicinally in many states, but now we were at a point where we started having recreational use. We held that very, very low positivity rate at around 3.1% during that very difficult period where we saw increased cannabis use and we were in this epidemic across the country. So what does that tell you? It doesn't tell us that there weren't drugs being used because we know there were. What it tells us is workplace drug testing works to deter use at work. And deterring use at work means that you are mitigating risk, right? That's really what it's about. Stop the event before it happens, right? If you think about it and you leave today's webinar and you think of nothing else, think about this as that Fitbit or that Apple Watch that you wear, right? Your 10,000 steps, is it going to guarantee that you don't have a stroke? Is it going to guarantee that you don't have a heart attack? Is it going to guarantee that you can fit in those jeans? Not necessarily, but it is pushing behavior. It's measuring behavior. And it's reminding you of what good behavior looks like to mitigate that risk. And that really is a reframing of what workplace drug testing is for those of you who have those policies and programs in your workplace. So if we move off of that and look a little bit more at where we are in the position we're in as employers and as an industry, looking at how cannabis is affecting us, we're digging a little bit deeper into some of the laws that are affecting and impacting us. And again, I'm a big advocate in being an advocate for this very valuable tool because risk equals cost, right? And everyone, whether you're a public company, a private company, if you're a one-person company, is interested in mitigating risk, controlling costs, and not doing harm. So we look at states like California and we look at states where Washington, and they're trying to figure this out. But it's complicated, right? Each of you on the phone probably started this saying, I'm in this. This is what I do. This is a part or all of my job, but I need to really understand more. So imagine if you're the person making the legislation and they're hearing the buzz and they know the problem and they're trying to figure out what the consequences are, but they're trying also to determine, well, how do I handle this? So we see some reaction to legal cannabis, Not sure it's really on the money in all these states, but what we did see is them saying, okay, we understand that it's not fair to look at cannabis use that is weeks, days, months old, right? So they're eliminating the use of urine and hair testing by stating that you need to look for the parent drug. You can no longer use technology for cannabis. And I'm strictly talking about that effective and useful tools, urine and hair in looking at other drugs. But because of this sort of gray area legality around cannabis, we needed to come up with an option, and an option needs to focus just on recent use, very recent use, right? Immediately before or at work that could impact the performance. And performance, again, it sounds like sort of this umbrella term. Performance is, are you late? Are you productive? Are you causing accidents? Are you causing incidents? Are you causing data breaches, right? Performance equals cost in many ways. And so what they said is we're going to look just at this recent use. So we're not going to look any longer back at those metabolites that can last for a longer period. Now, we believe that these states, because it was actually first California and then it became Washington, are going to be bellwether states. They're going to influence the laws, but we actually want them to get better at this even, right? We understand that that started to restrict it, but we needed to look better. And so you do need to look at your policies and your procedures in the states. For instance, if you're in Washington, you can no longer look at a cannabis test for pre-employment, the test for metabolites. You cannot have access to it after January 1st. Now, the complication is that there's always safety sensitive carve outs, right? But when you're looking at those safety sensitive carve outs, be mindful that sometimes when you're thinking about like the DOT, for instance, the DOT tells you, yeah, you have to use urine or oral fluid, right? So they allow you to do that. What the DOT doesn't tell you is what to do with that employee. How do you make an adverse or any employment action? They just tell you remove that person from performing safety sensitive job functions until they go through the SAP process and have a satisfactory return to duty test and they come back, right? So when you're thinking about the application of new technology and looking and isolating recent use, you need to consider that even as an overlay of your DOT testing as an additive test that only looks at that recent use, right? That only looks at that parent drug and not that far back metabolites. So we're seeing it continue to refine, and we will see this hopefully long. I wish it was going to be fast. I don't believe it's going to be fast. We'll continue to see this refinement of laws and the impacts to that over probably the next several decades. Now, again, we like that they're moving ahead. We like that they've recognized that there is a conflict between legal cannabis use, workplace drug testing, and roadside. We're not talking a lot about roadside today, but we like that they're improving it. But what we don't like are some of these things, right? So impairment specific language. We already talked about it. Workplace drug testing is about deterrence. Now you may detect, right? You may detect in the event of a reasonable suspicion issue or an accident at work. You're looking to detect and you're looking to pair that, right? If you think about reasonable suspicion, you're looking to detect, most of you have gone through a reasonable suspicion supervisory training, and you look at the signs and symptoms and you document it, and you often get a second supervisor or manager to document that and confirm it, and then you send that person or you have to Concentra or you have them come in and you test that person, right? You're not able to diagnose if it is impairment. And so we really are saying that is limiting language for employers. It's reaction to sort of the legalization and the downstream impact and problems that it's caused. But it really is not something that we want to see widely spread into the workplace. Now, whether or not they choose to come up with an impairment standard for roadside, that's an important measure. but it's not what we do in the workplace. We don't look for impairment. We look to deter problems before they start and to deter use at work. The safety sensitive carve outs, they're good, right? And I understand why. And obviously, safety sensitive positions can cause, if you think about it, and by the way, OSHA defines at a very broad scale what safety sensitive is. Some states actually have safety sensitive language that you need to look at. And you should look at all of those positions in your employee body and say which ones are defined as safety sensitive. And they may be the ones you want to pay special attention to. But I will remind you, when we think about fair and equitable, when you think about what your company's maybe DEI initiative is, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion. Sometimes safety sensitive testing only has this causation, right? There is a disparate impact on minority populations that historically make up a majority of safety sensitive jobs. So look at your entire workplace. And remember that safety sensitive jobs right now, or definitions right now, are sort of still based in that like industrial era. We think about safety as physical safety. Think about it, right? Fiscal safety, cyber safety, brand safety. We like the safety sensitive carve outs, but we'd actually like for testing to be allowed. For it to be the most effective tool for you as an employer, you really want to be able to test all of your employees to make it more equitable, to make it fair, right? And then finally, this reliance on subject matter experts. When New Jersey came up with this concept of a WIRE, which is a workplace impairment recognition expert, I was sort of dumbfounded because I'm like, well, we've always had that. That's reasonable suspicion. We train our supervisors and our employees on reasonable suspicion. That's what we do. You often, as an employer, are notified of an issue by another employee. We've always done that. That is mistrained, right? Those manager training programs have always existed. What we don't want is to see problematic legislation that restricts an employer's ability to ensure workplace testing is fair and to restrict the tool that you've had for all these years to being only based on these subjective measures. You want an objective measure, which is what your drug test is, and you don't want to wait for a problem to occur. You want to deter the problems from actually happening. And Vince is out talking to employers all the time. So Vince, maybe you could talk about what you're hearing from the field and take it from here for a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. And as usual, excellent job. Just as Nina is addressing all these state laws, it's really putting employers as a slideshow between a rock and a hard place, right? You want that safe workplace, but then the state laws are telling you how to test, what methods to test, when can you test, what groups of employees you can test, right? Although these state laws, I break it down like this. I live in Chicago. Illinois, obviously, is a recreationally legal state. And it's also has employee protections in the law, like many other states have. So I kind of break it down like this. What are the states that have employee protections, what they're really telling, and all the wording is different. Every state words it a little bit differently. But they basically are telling employers, hey, you can't penalize an employee if they use a legal product on their own time. And as we'll get into here in a slide or two, you can see that the current testing methods that we use aren't really good. They're great testing, tried and true, as Nina said, testing methods. And certainly, as the Quest Drug Test Index showed us all, has been a great, we know that it works as a deterrent for drugs in the workplace, but it doesn't do a good job of detecting recent drug use. So again, I've been in this industry a long time, like Nina, over 30 years. And, when I first started, I first started when the DOT first come in, and everything was zero tolerance, right? In the 80s, we had all those bad transportation accidents, right? The Amtrak derailment, the New York subway derailment, and things like that. And I never actually, to be honest, if you had told me 30 plus years ago that in my career that I'd see this level of marijuana legalization, and that employees would be prohibited in some cases from testing for cannabis, I would have thought you crazy, right? I mean, I never thought we'd get to this point, but here we are. And at this point, we also have this rare alignment of interest here. So we've got these groups that have kind of come together, and they've all got challenges with regards to the legalization of cannabis and the laws. Employers. So as Nina mentioned, I talk to employers and clinic groups, every day with my job at Hound Labs. And so what I've experienced in my career is that the last 6, 7 years before I joined Hound is employers operating in multiple states, some that have recreational legal cannabis, some that don't. They throw their hands up, right? A lot of them are starting to drop cannabis from their programs, at least for pre-employment. What they don't take in consideration is they're not doing anything on the back end to mitigate that risk, right? It's all about deterrence detection, as Nina said. So what we're seeing now, the National Safety Council did a survey in 2021 of about 225 employers who had dropped cannabis, and lo and behold, over 50%, I think it was 53% of the employers who dropped cannabis from their program saw an increase in workplace incidents, right? So again, we know now that dropping cannabis is simply not a solution, but employers also have to hire, they got to staff their workforce. And if they have cannabis in that pre-employment, I talk to clinic groups sometimes that they'll tell me, hey, Vince, my clients are calling me the robot because, I say, why? Well, they can't hire anybody because 40% of their candidates are testing positive for cannabis. So again, it allows, if the employer is going to drop cannabis in their pre-employment testing, they certainly need to do something to mitigate risk on the back end. Or they may be forced to fire somebody. If employers have a policy that's based on failing a urine test, then they have to take action against an employee who may not have used it, certainly during the workday or even within days of the workday. True example, I talked to an employer several months back who told me that they do random testing, and they had a pool of 20 people. They did a random test on one day, and 3 people tested positive for cannabis. And of course, it was 3 of this employer's best employees. So he ended up calling them all into his office and said, "Guys, what's up here?" And they all said, "Hey, we went to the Motley Crue concert last night. We never thought we'd be drug tested and lose our jobs here the next day." So again, segue to employees here. Employees want, they don't want to risk job loss due to his personal choices. Again, these employees clearly use cannabis, on their own time, after hours, as per in a state obviously where cannabis is legal. The legislators, they've got a balancing act to do here, right? So they know that employers have to maintain that safe workplace, but they also want to, make sure that employees have access to, if they live in a state where it's recreationally illegal, then they don't want to, stamp out those rights as well. So again, with the state laws, we're seeing the trends. Just to reiterate again, we're seeing more states enable employee protections. And then we're also seeing states, with California and Washington being the first 2, that are actually telling employers, what testing methods they can or can't use to test for cannabis. Finally, labor unions, historically not very pro drug testing, right? We've actually had a lot of response from labor unions. Usually drug testing, to my understanding, is it's kind of a bargaining chip. It's negotiated as part of a contract with unions, but unions who know about our solution actually have recommended to the employers that represent that, hey, this recent use test actually is fair. It's a lot more fair than the urine test, and we like it. So it's actually a kind of a good bargaining chip that unions are using now for their employees. All right, so now here's where we're at, basically, and here it says that era of legalization. I actually like to call it the era of acceptance, right? We're accepting cannabis much like we have for alcohol. Pre-legalization, everything was zero tolerance. Like I said, when I started in the industry, everything was zero tolerance, starting with the DOT programs in the late 80s, early 90s. Then as the private sector employers started, they all adopted that. Well, we follow the federal standards, we follow the DOT standards, right? So a lot of that now is really hard to do because of all these different state laws enabling and legalizing medical and also recreational cannabis. So those tried and true testing methods, urine, oral fluid, and hair, again, they're not testing. They're great tried and true methods, and they're very good at detecting, if a person has used a substance like cannabis, but unfortunately, they're not really good at detecting recent use. So in the era of legalization or acceptance, as I said, safety and fairness comes into play, and only breath testing are we able to measure that recent cannabis use. Again, not metabolites, not the past use, but that active parent drug. All right, going into a little bit about mitigating workplace. I'm just sharing a slide here that many of you may be familiar with, the different testing methods that we have. hair, obviously, more of a, I think I call it a lifestyle type drug test. So certain industries have gravitated toward hair over the years. They want to know, hey, we don't want to know if they used it in the last week or two. We want to know if, what their style, what their lifestyle is, if it includes using drugs. So you can see the detection in hair is up to 3 months. And in fact, it even takes several days, if not a week or more, for the drug to be detectable in hair. So certainly not a good tool for any recent drug detection. Urine testing, the most, tried and true, most popular, testing method out there. Again, you're still testing depending on a lot of biological factors and how often a person consumes cannabis. You're going back days, weeks, and even up to a month. So that positive urine test, and I use that concert example here a slide or two back, you don't know the person that positive urine test. What is that telling you as the employer? It tells you that person consumed cannabis, but if they say they use it at a concert over the weekend, then they could very well be telling the truth. Oral fluid has become popular the last 20 years or so. It does have a somewhat narrow window of detection. However, the studies that we're familiar with generally say that the oral fluid is still indicating a positive, or indicating usage rather, within the last 48 up to actually 72 hours. So it's only through breath that we're detecting that active THC, that not the metabolites, that we're able to detect within that recent use. Again, just, we've come to market here. Actually, Hound Labs has been spending a lot of time the last almost decade developing an instrument with a focus on detecting recent cannabis use. So just a kind of a high level overview of how that process would work when you go to a Concentra clinic and when the service is available, is that all the breath samples are captured on these, what we call them, cartridges, right? And there's a base unit that is not pictured here, but that kind of the base unit acts as, collects all the data on the drug test. And it collects it acts like an electronic chain of custody form. It's collecting the donor information, the type of test it is, the reason for test, all that information. So that, along with the donor breath capture, you see the donor would breathe into the cartridge via mouthpiece. And then once complete, the sample is sent to a laboratory for both screening tests and, of course, LCMS confirmation in the event of a non-negative. So this is like, we're not reinventing the drug testing wheel. We're following, all the standard drug testing protocol, including chain of custody and use of a SAMHSA certified lab. It's just that the novelty, I guess you call it, is that we're detecting recent use using breath for cannabis.
Okay, so everybody's busy all the time, as far as I could tell, at least in my world. And so what we're going to do now is sort of get down to some brass tactics on really thinking this through. We've set the stage. We've talked about the problem. We've looked at what we've talked about what we're hearing from the field. And, we talk a lot with the team at Concentra. We know that we're hearing things, but in the end, again, you can read articles, you can listen to the issues. It ultimately comes down to, well, what do I do, right? What do I do? I think that's really the challenge. So going back to where we started, drug testing is about deterrence. When you think about recent use and integrating technology that indicates recent use, and very recent use is what Vince mentioned, and it's the key, right? Immediately before or during work. We want to deter that. If you are taking your edibles or your tinctures or your trunks on Friday night, we don't want to know about that on Monday morning. When you think about your program and your policy, it really is time to break it back down. And again, being in this industry for a very long time, there've been many meetings where really this is about, like, well, what does it cost, right? What do you do? What does it cost? What do you do? What does it cost? It's time to look at, why are we doing it? The key factors are mitigating risk through the continuum of employment. What I did last month doesn't matter today, right? What I did when I joined the company 5 years ago is not super relevant today either. So it's important to think about continuous testing, right? Working with the team at Concentra, working with your internal safety department, right? Your CFO, they're the ones who are looking at the cost and saying, okay, how can we effectively set up a testing program that maintains safety? That's pretty critical, right? That mitigates the risk, right? prevent it. We want to contain risk as much and as best as we can. We want to deter use at work, right? We want to detect it if we need to augment basically the file in a sense in the event of an accident or a reasonable suspicion, right? But we also want to treat everybody equitably. We want to do this through as many employees as we can. And what are we looking for? We're looking to curb those risk things, and we're looking to improve productivity, right? So thinking about this in terms of all of the stages of employment, can you do pre-access testing? Can you bring a team in that tests people periodically before they're going on your job site? Can you send them prior to going on the job site to the location at Concentra and have them do a breath test to reinforce the policy that use before work of cannabis products is not okay, right? Random. People think about randoms as punitive. They're actually very fair, right? What they are doing is saying, I can't afford as an employer to test everybody every day, every second, right? That doesn't make sense. But what I want to do is reinforce that the policy is it's not okay, right? And so I'm a mom of 4 teenage daughters. I'll let everybody catch their breath there. And I often say, when you think about just doing pre-employment testing, I think about it as the beginning of the school year, which for the French household is always sort of like that time to renew, refresh, right? I don't say to the girls, okay, I see a boy in your room and I see a bong and I see a handle of vodka and a pack of cigarettes. Make good choices and close the door and hope that when we talked about what making good choices were, you're going to remember that and you're going to keep doing that. What I want to do is periodically make a quick tap on that door, knock it, and say, I'm coming in, right? I'm coming in. It's reinforcing the behavior that you want and the standards that you require. And so look at all of the reasons and all of the opportunities to drug test and communicate to your employees that this is not punitive, right? That this is something that's reinforcing behavior that makes you productive. If you're productive as an organization, right, it brings about those things that you want, which is profitability, right, which is a good workplace. All of those different things are really what you're shooting for. And legalization doesn't change this. You just have to look at what are the cannabis testing policies? How are you going to test? Incorporating new technology that really isolates that recent use. Think about recovery-centric workplaces, right? Think about ways that you can limit those non-negative results to employees who just used within the past few hours, right? Look at ways you can deter use between shifts. Think about fair ways of testing employees in your policy. And, it's interesting because, again, over all these years, I've seen reviews with clients who say, tell me what my positivity rate is, right? What's my positivity rate? I'm going to look at the ROI of my drug testing program based on how many positives I have and from what drug. By the way, you mostly know that many of those are cannabis positives, right? But that's the way a lot of people think. How many did I catch? I would really advocate that you move from a zero tolerance policy to a zero positive policy. Your effective communication, right? Your effective implementation and your effective testing should result in as close to a zero positivity rate as you can. What does that mean? It means, all right, I'm doing well, right? What I'm doing must be working because I know cannabis is legal at work. I know that people are using outside of the office, outside of the job site, right? But I also know that I'm using a recent use test. I'm able to keep my good employees here because I'm using something that's fair. I'm also able to deter that use. That's really what you're looking for, right? So decide what positions you'll test. Like I said, if you want to start looking at that safety sensitive population, be creative. One of the most important things is Work within the confines of the laws and the rules, but creativity is okay, right? If it makes sense to bring someone on site to do your drug testing, there are opportunities to do that, right? Talk to your team at Concentra. If there are opportunities, right, bring them on. A random doesn't have to be a person. A random can be a location or a shift. If you have the opportunity to integrate technology that says when you log into your computer and you're not in a safety sensitive job function, right? You get a notice that says go for a drug test and this is the address of that Concentra location and go and take the test, right? That's an important thing. So think about when will they be tested and what works best for you, and then work with the team to develop those programs, right? Change your policies to address this issue of recent cannabis use, and how will you align with the laws in the states, and how will you create policies that are deterrents? And again, sometimes that deterrence isn't zero tolerance. Sometimes that deterrence is saying, all right, first positive, this is the repercussions of that. We're going to stand you down, or we're going to put a warning in your file, or we're going to send you to a substance abuse professional, right? There's proven evidence of a couple things with workplace drug testing, right? A death at the workplace is over $1 million. I think it's 1.2 or $1.4 million for a death at the workplace. God forbid that happens, right? An automobile accident is over $80,000. A workers' comp claim averages over $40,000. You want to mitigate that risk. You want to prevent those costs, but you also want to support that workplace. So what is best for you? Having an initial cannabis positive may take another action, but it doesn't mean you have to say, I'm going to terminate you. Now, again, be creative, because safety sensitive, if you truly are looking at those physical safety sensitive positions, you might want to think about doing a higher random percentage with those, or having a different action that might be slightly more severe, using a SAP, having escalated testing once they return to duty. But as long as your policies and your programs are non-discriminatory in how you apply the testing standards and how you handle a non-negative or a positive result, then it's fair. And it still does what we talk about, which is deterring that use that causes you costs and risk. And then finally, think about how could you bring people back, right? If you've or testing back, I'm sorry. If you've already removed it, remember that stat Vince said, right? 53% who've removed cannabis testing because they were just trying to figure this whole thing out have now seen this increased incident and accidents. If you've removed it, look at your workers' comp claims, look at your absenteeism, look at your turnover. Those are all costs. And you want to see, is there a correlation between removing drug testing in our workplace for cannabis and increases in these areas? Because sometimes they're not so easy to find, but if you start to track them, you'll see it. And so review all of those different things and think about reinstating cannabis testing that looks at recent use. And then finally, educate employees, right? This webinar was provided for you from Concentra to educate you in a different way, not to lecture you about what the laws were, not to detail the complications of each state and the policies and what you can't do and what you can do, but to make you remember what workplace drug testing is about. Remember how important it is to your organization, and remember how this fits into the goals and values of your organization. Make sure that your employees get that same message, right? This is not punitive. This is fair. We are doing this for the benefit of all of us, management, shareholders, stockholders, the board, and you as an employee. And so providing them with education on how to be aware of the policy changes, what you're testing, how you're testing, when you're testing, and what it will detect is a really critical part of workplace drug testing to make a successful program. And so, Vince, I'll ask you if you have anything more before we sign off today.
No, I think we're good, Nina. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, we really appreciate everybody joining us today. And we look forward to having conversations with all of you in the future.
Thank you, Nina and Vince, for the excellent presentation. And thank you everyone who has joined us today for a discussion about mitigating workplace risk with cannabis breath testing. We hope you found this information to be informative, and Concentra plans to bring you more information on this topic in the future. This marks the end of today's presentation. We hope to see you again soon for another Concentra educational webinar.